Hello and welcome. So this will be our first series on faith. And I have been thinking about things for quite some time. And so I decided to talk about the unintuitive God from a mortal perspective. And so this is what we're going to be discussing. And so while there truly is nothing new under the sun, and I am sure that many, many, many of you have heard a lot of this before, I decided I'd throw my own take on things, and we'll see where it takes us. So, I wanted to start with David, and if anybody has grown up around the Bible or happens to have been in church for a while, I am sure that you will have heard of David. Shepherd boy, giant killer, king. But let's take a look at his story from the perspective of the unintuitive God. So, we have David, and he's minding his own business. He's playing the harp, possibly the lyre, doing his own thing in the fields, minding the sheep. And then along comes a bear or a lion or two, and he takes those down. And he uses a slingshot. You all know about this. It's nothing new. But then Samuel comes along, and Samuel, being a judge, has been told to anoint the next king of Israel, since Saul has failed. And, of course, Jesse calls out his sons, but not David. And Samuel isn't able to anoint any of them. So he finally anoints David. And then David goes back to the shepherd's fields. And you might think, well, okay. Or do you? Why aren't you thinking, okay, well, what happens next? So David has just been anointed as king. But that actually is treason, because Israel already has a seated king. And Saul has an heir. And that heir is Jonathan, the crown prince. And this is kind of important because God is sovereign and he has the right to appoint whomever he pleases. And there's something telling in this because, as far as I can tell, Jonathan didn't actually do anything wrong. I mean, nothing to actually earn his death, nothing to not allow him to be king. So, the sins of the father. Everybody looks at Saul and says, well, he was a bad king. But what did he really do that was so bad, other than disobey God? Which kind of is the worst thing he could have done. And if we're comparing Saul and David, to human eyes, it looks like David did a lot worse. But we'll get to that a little later. So, David goes back to the shepherd's fields. And then nothing. Nothing and nothing and nothing. Until finally, he goes to bring food to his brothers who are in the military. And then there's this guy named Goliath who's taunting the Israelites. And you would think that if this was, say, the movie version, David will just go take Goliath down. But that's not what actually happens. David goes and he finds out what the bounty on Goliath's head is. David doesn't just go and take Goliath out. There's this whole thing. He finds out what Goliath's head is worth. And then there's the whole, well, this armor doesn't work for me. And you might think, well, here's our young hero. Why is he just using a slingshot? Because, all the heroes use a sword, right? Well, not at first. David isn't trained with a sword. He isn't trained in armor. So that makes sense. But also he's going up against a seasoned military warrior, a champion, with nothing but a slingshot and faith. That's not intuitive. In fact, that seems downright crazy. Do you ever really stop and wonder why all of them were saying, yeah, this is a really bad idea. What the heck are you doing? Think about your own life for a second. How many of you have been in a similar position? Maybe you're not going up against a literal giant with a slingshot, but how many of you have stepped out in faith only for those around you, your brothers and sisters, those closest to you, to say, are you sure you should be doing this? Are you sure you should be starting your own business? Are you sure you should be taking that career path? There's a lot of unintuitive things which happen to all of us in life. And sometimes we should be listening to those around us. But if David had listened, he wouldn't have taken down Goliath. So there is a time to listen and a time not to listen. But moving forwards, David takes Goliath down, then draws his own sword, Goliath's own sword, and hacks off the giant's head. And after that, the Philistines flee. But then what happens? Well, David marries the princess, and he becomes brothers with the crown prince. The crown prince, who he's best friends with. And David is more loyal than a dog. He would die 1,000 deaths for Jonathan. And yet, Saul. And that happens to be my puppy right there. And she is wanting attention, as she does when I'm recording. So, you would think that Saul, king of all of Israel, would be absolutely ecstatic. A champion which has slain a giant is now part of his family. And David has severe daddy issues. Severe daddy issues. And if Saul had been just a little bit smart, he would have been the father that Jesse never was to David, and then he would have won David's loyalty. I mean, Jonathan already had David's loyalty. And even if David had succeeded Jonathan, who's to say that Jonathan wouldn't have died of old age, maybe without an heir, or maybe from disease, or maybe David would have been regent and king for a while, looking after Jonathan's son. After all, they did swear an oath to one another. And you would think that might be the way to go, because David has it made. He's the son-in-law of the king. He's besties with the crown prince. And he's got the princess. This is where you should probably fade to black for the next 15, 20, 30 years. But that's not what happens. Saul goes absolutely crazy, pursues David for 13 years. And David, who plays Robin Hood, gathers a band of misfits around himself. But it's telling that the misfits find him. And because he slew Goliath, he's already a hero in their eyes. And they're not exactly what you might consider elite forces material. But somehow they become that. And David expresses a longing for some water from some random town. And they go and they break in a heavily guarded enemy town. They bring him some water and then he pours it out on the ground as a drink offering. Does that sound intuitive to you? Or how about this? David's family are taken, along with the other families of the men. And bearing in mind, David has already taken at least one other wife at this point. At least. We're not going to go into that too much. But he's never condemned for that. And so, his family's taken. His men's family are taken. And you would think that this band of men that he raised up from the dirt, trained into elite soldiers, they would be backing him. Instead, they pick up stones. They're about to kill him. And you have to wonder what is going through David's mind at this point. Does he remember the anointing oil from Samuel? Does he remember when he faced down Goliath, said, "How dare you defy the Holy One of Israel?" Of all those victories. And then he strengthens himself in the Lord. And he goes and he gets his family back and his men's family back. And then word reaches him that Saul and Jonathan have been slain in battle. And of course he's made king, because who else is there? But the way that story goes is not what you might expect. It's not. And then when David is at his most safe, at his most secure, at least when he thinks so, in the season when kings go off to war, that's when David has his fall from grace. But you know, when we do feel most secure, when we have had our biggest victory, it tends to be when we're the most vulnerable. Look at Elijah, for example. 400 priests, prophets, of a false god, a victory right there. And then what happens? Yeah. Or how about Adam and Eve in the garden? That's safe. That's secure, right? Did God really say that? Will you really die if you eat this fruit? We have to be on our guard. And we have to be praising the Lord when he gives us victories. So David's story is not an intuitive one. If you were writing it as a writer, how would you have written it? Certainly not like that, surely. Think back on your own life. How intuitive has your story been? Has it gone the way that you desired? When did it change? Where has it changed? How many times? What has cropped up that you might not like? And yet, has God been positioning you for increase? Has he been using it for your good? Next time, we're going to look at Joseph and how his story is unintuitive. We're also going to look at the Exodus and the Red Sea, and Ruth, Esther, and then we're going to look at Jesus. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope it's blessed you. Do subscribe. And if you want prayer, just let us know. Anyway, I will be seeing you. Bye for now.